Hi everyone, this is Eric Paparo. Thanks for joining me and Shamim this morning. We're going to run through some slides about our product approach and then leave time for questions. Please ask your questions in the chat window if you can. This is a really important subject, but also a really complex and confusing subject. And we don't have all the answers. We're going to go through our approach, what we've learned about what's going on in the market and where there's still question marks, and do our best to support our customers' success. So the goals for today is to review what we're doing on the product side. We've sent several emails about our product changes, but we want to go into a little more depth here, and we will provide a copy of this deck afterwards, so you'll be able to look at the data that we're presenting in more detail if we go too fast. We're going to discuss some of the industry issues that are emerging, where some players in the industry are inconsistently applying their understanding of the laws and what we're doing about it, and last questions. So at a high level, I want to kind of highlight why this is complicated. So if you go from left to right, from a publisher's perspective, they have to get consent in some form to use their users' data, and there are this new emerging class of companies called CMPs or consent management platforms that they can then include some subset of the vendors they want to work with, and those vendors are generally going to be data processors. And in this conversation, I'm assuming everyone has enough familiarity with the law to follow along about data processors, data controllers, etc. And that's pretty straightforward from a publisher's perspective. If you look at number 2 on the far right side, and most of the folks on this call as Beeswax customers have a relationship with the end consumer, and it's the same sort of idea. If you have an end relationship with the end consumer, you can get consent to email them, to target them with ads, to do whatever it is, and put it into your customer relationship management system, CRM. And you can provide that data to us as your DSP, and we're a data processor as well. We just do with the data what you tell us to. We don't own any data. We don't make any decisions. We really just have the data on your behalf. But the really hard part is that as the exchanges pass auctions to the DSPs, and the DSPs respond to them and use that data, there's a very ambiguous and confusing relationship as to how we're allowed to use that data. Because we may, in some cases, have consent from the end user explicitly, and we may not, and our customers may or may not. And that's the crux of the problems in this marketplace, as well as some of the product decisions we've made in order to protect ourselves and protect our customers while trying to be as flexible as possible. So hopefully we'll be able to explore some of the choices we've made and how we think they're going to be the best of all worlds in this very difficult environment. So with that, let's just go through the product changes. So at a high level, we have 5 categories of product changes. First is isolating the GDPR auctions, so making sure that we know when we're in the GDPR environment and when we're not, and we'll go through that in a little bit of detail. Second, and probably the most impactful for customers, is how we're handling personal data hashing. So in cases where our customers do not have consent, we have to be careful about what data we allow through in logs and in our APIs. Third is from the exchange side, how they're handling consent and how we're handling the consent they pass us. Fourth, and this is very important for anyone who's in the mobile app market, is that post-back handling is changing in a way that will break conversions in Europe unless you make some changes. So that's the one important action item that hopefully people will get out of this webinar. And last is compliance with the GDPR data portability requirements. We'll talk about what we're doing in that regard. All right, so I'm going to talk about what we're doing at a high level. So what we want to do is make it as easy as possible to be compliant in this environment. And so what we're doing is we're isolating the GDPR request by data center. And effectively, if you're only in the US or APAC data centers that we run, we don't want you to have to worry about GDPR requests. And we've done some research. It's a very, very small number of auctions that come from an EU country but are in the US or APAC data centers. And so what we're going to do is drop them. So as soon as a request comes into US data center, if it is from based on the geo lookup, we say the user's in the UK, we're just going to drop that request and not allow anyone to bid on it, not allow anyone to see it. So this simplifies compliance with US only customers pretty significantly. In the European data center, we're going to be conservative. So there's a signal coming from the exchange, it's called is GDPR. And if the request comes in with that signal, we're going to treat it as GDPR relevant. And in addition, if we do a geo lookup and it's from one of the GDPR countries, we're also going to treat it as GDPR compliant. So either or, because we can't depend on the exchanges consistently passing that signal. If it's in the EU data center and it's from a non-GDPR country like Switzerland or Russia, we will not treat it as GDPR. So I'm going to hand this over to Shamim to talk a little bit about what we're doing on the data side.
Hey everyone, this is Shamim. So I'm going to go through some of the details around how we're actually going to handle hashing personal data and the changes that you'll see in logs and in macros. So at a high level, just going through sort of, again, from left to right, how this all works, is that the exchanges, and most exchanges, are going to continue to send Beeswax auctions with personal data in the clear. So cookies and IPs, et cetera, will be in the clear for the most part. Some exchanges are taking the stance of hashing personal data if Beeswax does not have consent, but those are in the minority of exchanges. So that's sort of the first thing to understand, is that some exchanges are handling things a bit differently. Second, once we receive that request, as a processor, we're going to still use the unhashed user IDs to match. So any segment targeting or IP address targeting or frequency cap, any use of personal data, we'll use in an unhashed manner for matching. And then in 3 and 4, which is when we send that data to either the raw logs or to a customer's bidding agent or augmenter. So unless you, the end customer, has explicit consent, the data fields will be hashed so that they can't be re-identified with the end user. And in the next slide, I'll talk through exactly how we're handling the hashing for each of the fields. So the first column are the current fields in the logs. Second column is how we're going to treat them. And the last column is how we're handling macros, which is a bit different. So for reporting fields, which are the first 2 columns, the basic takeaway is that in the case where we need to hash something, we're creating a new field so that and blanking out or truncating the current field. So just looking at user ID as an example, if it's an EU request and there is no consent, we'll blank out the user ID, the current user ID field. We're adding a new field called user ID hashed, and that'll have a hash value. We don't want to sort of change the behavior of your or put hash values in the existing field. So we're treating it as 2 different fields. For geo lat and long, we aren't introducing new fields. We're simply truncating the last 3 decimal places if it's in the EU. And for IP address, we're doing sort of a hybrid. So the current field will be truncated to the first 3 octets, and then the hashed versions will be hashed. So that's sort of what we're doing with logs. On the creative macro side, we're taking a different approach, which is we don't want your existing creatives to break, and so we don't want to require you, with the exception of post-back handling, which we'll talk about, to have to change any of your creative macros. So the values in those macros will change, and you can see the details here. They'll either be hashed or blank or truncated, depending on the field.
So Shamim mentioned consent, and this is probably the biggest conversation that's happening in the industry right now. So we want to spend a moment or 2 talking about the current state of the consent frameworks and what we're doing about them. So first of all, on the IAB side, we're an approved vendor. We were actually, I think, the first approved vendor, which is cool, or maybe the second. the exchanges are taking different approaches to the use of consent. So some exchanges are claiming legitimate interest, and they're effectively not going to look for the framework signals in their approach to the publisher sites, and they're just going to send us requests without that information. Some are going to only send requests to Beeswax when we have consent explicitly. And Shamim actually mentioned there's another option, which is that some are hashing the data when we don't have consent, or removing the personal data. And then most of them, frankly, are sending us the data whether or not we have consent and relying on us to do something about it. So this is a mess. I mean, it would be great if it was simpler, if there was some uniformity here. But right now, the exchanges are taking really different approaches to this, and we're on the other side of that, watching it and trying to figure out what to do. Now, to make it worse, Google has opted out of the IAB program, and they have their own program. They have their own list of vendors, and we're also an approved vendor for Google, which is great. They're taking a very strict approach where they're only going to send us auctions when we're explicitly given consent. And we expect in the short term for the number of AdX auctions in Europe to significantly decline. I think there's just no way around this, that if on next Thursday they only send requests to have Beeswax explicitly opted in, and very few publishers have implemented any consent screens, that the volume of AdX should decline very significantly. There's no way to to make a good story out of that. That's just the truth. We don't know, but that's what we think. In addition, AdX is being incredibly strict about whether you can win an impression, depending on the combination of vendors that you have in a request. So, for example, if we bid on a request where Beeswax has consent, but you're using a seismic tag, it will not be eligible to win unless seismic also has consent. So in addition to reducing the number of auctions, it will reduce the ability to win auctions, especially for creatives in a desktop environment that may have a lot of different vendors involved. I know this isn't good news, but we just want to tell you what's going on. So in this slide, we're going to talk about what we're doing about this. So with regard to the IAB consent, we're going to start by logging the consent string. So to the extent the consent string is being sent to us, we're logging it. We're going to closely monitor the data that's being sent from these exchanges. We're not going to act on this string right now. We're going to watch it and see what it looks like. And we're going to continue bidding on these requests, regardless of what the consent string says, as of next Thursday. We're going to watch it, and this may change over the next 30 to 60 days, depending on how the whole industry reacts and also what the data looks like. What we plan on doing in our roadmap fairly soon is looking for any of our customers who are also on the consent string and sort of whitelisting those requests. So if a customer of ours has explicit consent, we will not hash the data that's being passed to their bidding agent and log files. That's not available for next Thursday, but that is on the roadmap to do. On DoubleClick, what we're going to do is we already have the ability to declare technical vendors in the creative level and in our Buzz UI and API. We're going to extend that to also support the AdX requirements about having multiple vendors, so that you could declare that you're using, let's say, Seismic as a vendor. And the advantage will be that if you do declare these accurately, we will make that creative ineligible to serve where it can't win, and that will improve your win rates when you do have the proper amount of consent. If this is not done, the only implication will be that you'll be potentially bidding on auctions that you cannot win on AdX. And so this is, we'll have to watch this and see how much it affects people, how our win rate declines on AdX based on this data. And the roadmap item here that we won't have for next Thursday, but we'll do within, I would say probably within a month or so, is to help with the auto detection of vendors. So if you have a seismic tag, we'll automatically set seismic. If you have a flash talking tag, we'll automatically set flash talking. That shouldn't be that much longer, but we won't have it available for next week.
And so I'll talk through the mobile postback situation. So again, as an end customer, the things you need to know that are changing are, one, the fields and logs, two, how we're sending those fields to your bidding agent and augmenter, and third, which is mobile postbacks, which requires, the one thing that really requires a change if you're running through a mobile postback provider and running campaigns in the EU. So just an overview of how this postback world works. Going from left to right, when someone clicks on an ad, currently you use a macro and put the user ID that is then sent to the postback provider in the click URL. So they have the user ID of the user that clicked. When the actual user clicks, the postback provider redirects the user to the right page within the appropriate app store to install the app. The providers have an app SDK installed in the app so that when the user actually does convert and opens up the app, they can get the user ID and attribute it back to the click. And so that's how sort of this world works, as you know. What's changing is the following. So we have a new macro called user ID underscore SHA-1. So it'll expand to a SHA-1 hash version of the user ID. And what you'll need to do in the EU is change, if your current macros are sort of the unhashed version, which is just user underscore ID, you'll need to change it to the user underscore SHA-1 version.
There may also be additional fields you need to add per vendor. So you should definitely read the help article that's linked here in our help center, and we'll send out this deck with the link to that, because some of the vendors also require you to declare which encoding you're using.
Yeah, that's correct. And the last thing I'll say is sort of, if you can make this change regardless of if you're serving ads in the EU or not. It'll work in the US as well. But it is optional if you're not running in the EU. Yeah.
So data portability, so the GDPR requires that end users can request data from providers about what they have about them. Now, since we're a data processor, we don't own any data, and we're not comfortable with the idea of providing a list of, say, segments that a user is associated with across our customers. That's really our customers' data. So what we are going to make available as soon as next week is a screen like the one on the right, which will allow a user to provide a cookie and to get a message that allows them to opt out of Beeswax if they choose, and then basically a manifest of which of our customers have data on that person, along with a link to the customer's privacy policies. So in the example on the right, it shows company 1 with the privacy policy, company 2 with the privacy policy, etc. And we are going to maintain that list. If you have some different privacy policy you'd like to link people to that's not the obvious one on your website, send us an email and we'll make sure to use the proper one. So let me go over some sort of non-product changes quickly. So in addition to the stuff we talked about, Beeswax has done the following. We've updated our privacy policy, which is relevant to as we collect data on your behalf. We've done a complete internal audit. So we brought together a cross-functional team in Beeswax and made a document that talked about every single piece of data we have and its retention, access, and deletion policies. And we're tightening all of those things. So we found areas where we were retaining data longer than we were supposed to or longer than we needed to. And we've already started deleting and purging that data where it doesn't affect any customers. And we're going to continue to do that to try to be as good a citizen as possible. We have sent all European customers a DPA contract, which we would like to have signed by the 25th. The contract was written to be very customer friendly and really is mostly about our obligations to you under GDPR. If you have any questions about that, talk to your account manager. We're not requiring US only customers to sign this, but we'll be happy to have them sign this if they would like. And lastly, we've been very actively working on legal agreements with our exchange supply partners. In many cases, they're sending to us, and we've been doing our best to get those all signed before the 25th. So in conclusion, what are the next steps? And then we'll open a Q&A because we probably have a lot of questions. So between now and next Thursday, what do we need to do? The most important thing is that you have to update your mobile post-back click URLs if you're doing business in the EU, or you will stop getting conversion data. That is vital. If you're using log files or bidding agents, you should build to ingest the new hashed fields in your logs, or else on the 25th you'll start getting a lot of blanks and nulls in your existing ingestion. And we've made sure to put those fields out there in production so you can at least see them and build around them, even though they're not being filled until the 25th. On the 25th, we're going to flip the bid, and the EU fields will be hashed, and the existing fields will go null. And then over the next 60 days, we're going to monitor the usage of the consent signals, and we'll come back to you with guidance on what we're going to be doing about the IAB consent signals and how they're going to affect our treatment of data in terms of responding to auctions.